U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer quietly released a set of numbers from U.S. Customs and Border Protection that should have set off alarms across Washington, because buried inside those dry statistics was the outline of a collapse no one wanted to name: more than 400,000 fewer travelers crossing into the United States by car, tens of millions of cross-border trips simply vanishing, and over $28 billion in Canadian visitor spending evaporating without a single formal announcement, without a recession, without a border closure, and without any visible crisis trigger, leaving entire American towns hemorrhaging more than half of their economic activity, not because Canadians ran out of money, but because Canada, almost silently, chose to walk away. And what followed was not a tourism slowdown, but a structural rupture driven by a modern trade conflict that transformed everyday consumer behavior into a geopolitical weapon, collapsing border crossings by more than one-third in key northern corridors and gutting retail-dependent towns, where discretionary Canadian activity fell by nearly two-thirds, wiping out billions in local commerce almost overnight. Yet the most dangerous truth remained unspoken, because this collapse did not begin with economics at all, but with a psychological fracture so deep that dignity, trust, and national perception shattered at the same moment. And once that line was crossed, recovery didn't slow down. It fundamentally broke, because when confidence leaves, habits change, and when habits change long enough, they do not revert, they lock in. And according to open source transportation data and regional economic modeling, the initial shock was only the opening act, as Canadian visitors, who historically generated more than $80 billion annually across travel, lodging, food, retail, and entertainment, began pulling back, creating obvious surface damage like empty hotels and half-filled restaurants, but hiding a far more destructive multiplier effect beneath, because every dollar that failed to cross the border removed between $1.7 and $2.3 from local economies once wages, supply chains, and tax receipts were factored in, meaning conservative models now estimate that the Canadian withdrawal is stripping between $150 and $200 billion from the U.S. economy every single year when secondary impacts are counted, a figure comparable to the entire economic output of multiple mid-sized states, with border counties and tourism corridors absorbing the worst of it first, triggering a brutal labor shock across hospitality and travel industries that support one of the largest employment ecosystems in the country, where between 1 and 1.5 million jobs have already been eliminated, suppressed, or never created. Not abstract numbers, but hotel workers, drivers, restaurant staff, cleaners, vendors, and seasonal employees whose livelihoods vanish quietly without headlines, forcing state and municipal governments into immediate crisis as hotel occupancy taxes collapsed, sales tax collections weakened, airport authorities deferred billion-dollar capital projects, and tourism-dependent cities froze hiring and cut public services once revenue assumptions failed, creating a self-feeding downward loop where fewer services made cities less attractive, fewer visitors reduced revenue further, and declining revenue weakened services again, all without any formal boycott or declaration, just millions of individual decisions compounding into systemic failure. And this is where the story darkened further, because the next phase had nothing to do with tourists at all, and everything to do with capital, credit, and confidence. As investment flows began reassessing risk across entire regions, once tourism revenue collapsed, pushing hotels below break-even thresholds, hollowing out retail corridors built around cross-border traffic, dragging property valuations down with them, and triggering what can only be described as a repricing event, as commercial real estate tied to hospitality and retail lost between 1/5 and more than 1/3 of its value in several northern markets, forcing lenders to pull back, refinancing to dry up, credit conditions to tighten, projects to be canceled, partially completed developments to be abandoned, and open source banking data to show sharp contractions in lending across tourism-heavy counties, freezing entire local economies, even for businesses with no direct exposure to travel, while municipal finances slipped into the danger zone as cities that pledged future hotel and tourism taxes to service long-term debt suddenly found the math no longer worked, opening structural revenue gaps measured in the hundreds of millions, forcing deferred infrastructure, reduced services, and compounding damage that does not reverse quickly, because when capital retreats, job losses accelerate beyond tourism into construction, suppliers, and professional services, pushing total job losses and suppressed job creation toward nearly 2 million nationwide, concentrated in regions with the fewest alternatives, stretching recovery timelines from years into decades, while airports and transportation authorities absorbed another blow as international passengers disappeared, fee revenue collapsed, and expansion projects worth billions were postponed or canceled, erasing assumptions of permanent growth in cross-border travel, feeding a cycle where declining cities became less attractive, lower visitation, reduced revenue, weakened services, and weaker services accelerated outmigration, transforming localized tourism losses into regional economic decline, even as capital itself didn't vanish but relocated, with Canadian institutional investors redirecting funds away from U.S. tourism-linked assets toward domestic and overseas markets deemed more stable. Because once a destination is classified as unpredictable, that stigma lasts far longer than any tariff, and this is the moment policymakers should fear most, because the collapse is no longer driven by travel decisions but by confidence erosion. And when confidence leaves, money follows. When money leaves, jobs vanish. And when jobs vanish, communities hollow out. Yet the most devastating stage still lay ahead, as open-source consumer behavior modeling revealed a permanent rewiring of habits, showing that once travel patterns shift beyond a short cycle, the probability of full reversal collapses, and scenario analysis now suggests that more than 3/4 of Canadian travelers have already restructured their default travel behavior, making the United States no longer the automatic option, but the exception, permanently removing between $80 and $100 billion in direct spending capacity annually, even under conservative assumptions, with secondary effects pushing economic drag toward $200 billion per year, losses that persist because habits, once locked in, shape generations as families stop crossing borders, businesses sign multi-year contracts elsewhere, airlines reallocate fleets, routes vanish, and losses become embedded, driving employment impacts toward 2 to 2.5 million jobs eliminated or never created, concentrated in border regions and service-based cities, creating long-term unemployment pockets that strain social systems and public trust, while municipal finances enter a second failure phase with cumulative shortfalls climbing into the tens of billions, credit ratings weakening, borrowing costs rising, and commercial real estate facing long-term value impairment exceeding 1/3 of pre-collapse levels, leading to foreclosures, abandoned developments, and frozen investment zones, all without continued political tension, because once habits lock in, the damage becomes self-sustaining, turning what analysts now describe as a structural downsizing of the U.S. tourism and service economy into a permanent reset with fewer jobs, weaker cities, and reduced global pull, a shift that doesn't stop at tourism but bleeds into education, investment, and demographic decisions as Canadian students, once one of the largest and most stable foreign cohorts in U.S. universities, begin choosing alternatives, removing tens of billions in tuition and local spending while weakening future talent pipelines in healthcare, engineering, and technology, even as long-duration investors increasingly classify U.S. tourism-linked regions as structurally impaired rather than temporarily stressed, potentially locking hundreds of billions in reinvestment and refinancing permanently out of affected regions, while prolonged downturns trigger population loss measured in the hundreds of thousands, shrinking tax bases, weakening schools, reducing healthcare access, and accelerating political dissatisfaction, compressing shifts that once unfolded over decades into a single economic cycle where behavioral change, capital withdrawal, institutional hesitation, and demographic drift reinforce one another, eroding not just finances but soft power itself, because when a country loses its position as the default destination for travel, education, investment, and opportunity, it loses influence in ways GDP never captures, and perception modeling already suggests restoring favorability after such shifts can take a generation or more, while Canada experiences the inverse effect as confidence compounds and dependence fades through quiet substitution rather than confrontation, proving that withdrawal is survivable, a lesson now studied by other allied economies as a working model of how consumer behavior and capital allocation can discipline a superpower without protest or escalation, and scenario analysis shows that if even a small group of advanced partners replicate part of this behavior, the impact could strip between $300 and $500 billion annually from the broader U.S. service economy, escalating into trillions over time as a permanently lower baseline, quietly reshaping national priorities as fewer visitors mean fewer jobs, weaker consumption, lower tax revenue, constrained defense and infrastructure spending, and an erosion so subtle it never looks like collapse, because airports still operate and cities still exist, just thinner, weaker, and more constrained, until stagnation becomes normal and the United States becomes optional, not fallen, but slowly bypassed, as the system continues moving without headlines, without ceremonies, without a moment when the lights go out, leaving behind a warning not just about Canada leaving, but about what happens when confidence leaves the United States and teaches everyone else how to do the same.